Good evening. Welcome to tonight's installment of the American Shoulder and Elbow's Virtual Fellows Core Curriculum Series. This new series starting tonight is on practice management, and to formally introduce tonight's session is immediate past president of the American Shoulder and Elbow Society, Dr. William Levine. Bill?
Hi, Rajan. Thanks very much, everybody. It's great to see our fellows and some of our residents joining for the first of this 8-week series. I'd like to personally thank Ranjan Gupta and Samar Hassan, who are the co-chairs of the ASES Education Committee, in conjunction with the ASES Committee on Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, chaired by Sarah Edwards. They've put together this 8-week series on practice management. And without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Samar for the first session. And thanks everybody for joining us. We look forward to a great series. Thanks.
One final, before we hand our Samar, for the participants, please use the chat room. We will, both Dr. Levine and I will be monitoring the chat room and we'll be feeding the questions to the panelists. So please, anytime you feel it, please use the chat room. Dr. San?
Thank you, Dr. Gupta. Thank you, Dr. Levine. I'm excited to be a part of this. I'm going to go ahead without further ado and share the screen.
All right.
So hopefully everyone can see this. Again, this is the first of an 8-part series on practice management and development. Title of today's discussion and panel is Securing Your First Job and Contract Negotiations. I thought so the timing of this is apropos as folks are, either thinking about contract negotiations or just about to sign, or certainly well on their way to looking around whether they're a fellow or a chief resident and so forth. And so my disclosures are not relevant, with the caveat that I'm a co-chair of the ASES Education Committee alongside Dr. Gupta, who's chairing the committee this year. And again, as you've just heard, this is part of an effort that has been initiative spearheaded by Dr. Levine, and it's a winter bridge to the remaining didactic series that'll resume in the spring. And as you can see, it's obviously aimed at shoulder and elbow fellows, but also we've expanded the ability for chief residents and senior residents also to get in on the call, because they're going to be setting out, getting their first real job as orthopedic surgeons in the coming months. And so again, these are the titles. It's a fantastic series that is very diverse and thorough, and we're going to lead it off and hopefully set the tone for these next 8 weeks. So I'm a shoulder and elbow surgeon in Cincinnati in my 20th year in practice. Joining me on this distinguished and diverse panel is Dr. James Gregory, who's a shoulder and elbow surgeon in Houston, Texas, an assistant professor at the University of Texas Health Sciences Center, and a mentor to both residents and fellows. As well, joining me is Jennifer Boyle-Mehta, who's an attorney in suburban Philadelphia and an expert on physician contract negotiations, and also married to an orthopedic traumatologist, Dr. Samir Mehta at Penn. So she's got a unique perspective, if you will, on both sides. And then as well, joining me is Mike McCaslin, who's a principal with Somerset CPAs out of Indianapolis, specializes in physician representations regarding practice negotiations and mergers, a frequent instructor and speaker at the Academy on practice management courses, and someone whom I know personally, as I've worked with him twice as we onboarded from private practice setting to hospital employment and stayed there. So the agenda, we're halfway into this, just talking a little bit about what we plan to do, and then the order of the panelists giving their talks is Dr. Gregory, and then Dr. Gregory, and then Jennifer Boyle, and then Mike McCaslin. We'll start with the kind of the perspective of the resident fellow. What are you thinking about as to securing your first job? And then from an attorney perspective, negotiating a contract, strategies and terms, and then thinking outside the box. Mike will share some of these pearls, and don't forget these questions. We're going to make sure we have ample time for Q&A. And again, our goal is to make these sessions an interactive experience. If there are any immediate questions as we transition from one talk to the other, there'll be an opportunity to ask questions, but I think most of the questions hopefully will be done in an interactive format where we can really kind of rely on the expertise of the panel. As Dr. Gupta mentioned, please use the chat function, which will be monitored. I will do it, but also Dr. Levine and Dr. Gupta. And then we'll make sure that we provide email addresses so that you can reach out to us after the session. So, your career decisions as fellows and residents are going to be the most important career decisions, your first decision. You're going to be thinking about factors like practice type, practice location, compensation. Those are probably the three main ones, but depending on your situation, there are going to be a whole lot of others. Who you're going to be working with, who are going to be your colleagues in the future, what are your call obligations, what are leadership or advancement opportunities. Those may be very important to you as well. In terms of practice type, and Dr. Gregory will mention some of these as well, there's hospital employment versus private practice, but there are also some other specifics and some hybrid models. Academic practice could be university where you're salaried, but it could also be private practice as well. And so we hope to learn a little bit about that today. Practice location could be geographical, whether you want to practice in Key West or Duluth, Minnesota, but even within a city, it can be very varied from being in the sort of urban hub, if you will, suburban, far suburban, rural. And so there's a lot of variations. And your practice location may be dictated by family constraints or preferences. If you're expecting your third set of triplets, it may be important that you sort of figure out where the grandparents are going to be that may be able to help out as you raise your family. And then compensation. There are going to be a whole lot of issues: salaries, productivity, ownership, buy-in, ancillary income, and what are the sources, performance incentives, and particularly hospital employed. And the caveat is there are going to be wide variations in compensation based on practice type, location, payer mix, call obligations. And one sobering statistic they came across is a 51% turnover within the first 5 years in practice amongst orthopedic surgeons, suggesting that tuning into the series may have some value so that you're in the 49% that finds a job and happy with it and stays with it. So with that sort of intro, I'm going to pass the torch to Dr. Gregory.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hassan. And so a little bit of background about me. I'm in my 6th year of practice, and I wanted to give you guys a little overview of stuff that I wish I would have known about when I was starting out. So you can go to the next slide, please. Or I guess, can I click it? No, I guess not. So only disclosure, I'm a member of the ASES Education Committee. That's anyone relevant. Next slide. So overall outline, I'm going to take a 30,000-foot view of this to hopefully stimulate some discussion at the end. Big thing, taking a view about what practices look like now, what you should look for on the job hunt, some of the different practice options, and how to actually go about the nuts and bolts of getting a job. Next slide. So in 2018, AOS put out some data, and you can see that depending on where you are in the US, the density of orthopedic surgeons varies widely. So Pacific Northwest, Northeast, very dense. Next slide. And we can see that surgeons are staying in practice longer. So this may mean that if you join a group, people that you expect to retire may not be retiring as early as they used to 10 years ago. Next slide. Overall, orthopedics remains a predominantly male-dominated field, as you can see. Next slide. And overall, although it's slowly changing, it's primarily dominated by Caucasians as well. Next slide. And if you look at how specialization occurs, so in 2018, approximately 60% of the orthopedic surgeons consider themselves specialists and 40% were generalists. Next slide. And this changes over time. So over 10 years, people are getting more specialized and generalists are becoming less and less common. That's important for how you market yourself when you go out into practice. Next slide. If you look at this pie chart of different practice environments, over 50% of people, which are the blue, kind of pink and green on the right side of the chart, are in private practice. Academic and hospital-based practices make up the other two large components. And so the hospital practice is really increasing. Next slide. And if you look at the size of practices, small groups are becoming less and less common, and larger groups are becoming more prevalent. There's a variety of different economics and economy of scale reasons for this that we can talk about later if you guys are interested. Next slide. So overall, that's a big picture about what practices look like, because it's important to realize if you're looking for jobs in certain environments, it's going to be more competitive. But it's important, as you guys are ASES fellow members or potentially resident members who are going to be shoulder elbow surgeons, it's important to know that being specialized is important. It can help you. And although orthopedics remains male-dominated, Caucasian-dominated, that's slowly changing. And hospital systems and larger groups are the trend. So it's important to understand the pros and cons of those environments. Next slide. So what should I actually look for in getting a job? So I think it's important to really know what your preferences are, start big picture, and then kind of hone down and think about your long-term goals. In my opinion, one of the big reasons, as Dr. Hassan gave the stat about orthopedic surgeons changing jobs in 5 years, is that expectation may not match reality. So it's important to understand what your expectations are and understand what the reality of the job is to make sure there's no mismatch. Next slide. And so most important in my mind is figuring out what you want. And it's important to do this on the front end, ideally before you start the job search process. And it's important to also talk about this with your family. So what's important to you may not necessarily be what's important to your spouse or your significant other. And this box on the right is some things that I listed that may factor into your jobs hunt. Next slide. And once you kind of come up with your preferences, start big picture. So I sometimes have fellows come to me and say, hey, you know what? I've got 2 job offers. This one is this many dollars per RVU. This one's got this buy-in for the partnership. And before you get into that level of detail, think big picture. So which job makes you excited? Which job are you hesitant about? How does this match up with what you want? It's very unlikely you're going to find a job that checks all the boxes. More than likely, you're going to have to make a sacrifice, and you need to figure out what that sacrifice is going to be. And can you envision yourself in that environment? If you can't, don't get into the weeds about negotiation. Trust your judgment. Start looking somewhere else. I think it's really important to kind of see the forest through the trees. Next slide. And part of that involves looking at long-term goals. And so just like when you're a med student looking at residency, the tendency is to focus on, hey, how much hands-on stuff do I get intern year? What's the PGY 2-year yike? But it's really thinking about a big picture. It's a career. And so you want to see what these long-term goals are and figure out, can you reach this through the opportunity? If you want to be a nationally known shoulder elbow surgeon and you're joining a group where no one's interested in research, there's no research support, that's going to be a much harder road. You need to know what it means to be successful. So what's success to you and what's success to the group? Because if that's different, it's going to be very, very challenging to be in that environment. And it's important to understand best and worst case scenarios. So if everything breaks the way you hope, it could be the perfect job. But if everything goes against you, what's going to happen? How do you get out? And it's important to talk to people who have left that environment to maybe see what some of that worst case scenario can be. Next slide. So after that, then I think it's important to look at the details. And our other panelists are going to cover a lot of this stuff, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time, but really income, understanding the negatives, the downside risk, what's your exit strategy, how do you get out if things go bad, how are you going to be successful in terms of resources? It's great to want to be the busiest surgeon, but if you can't get any patients, it's not going to work. Do you like your colleagues? And is it a good culture fit? I think culture is very important. Next slide. So going into this, some pros and cons of different practice options to figure out, again, how this is going to match up with your preferences. So I'm going to focus on private and hospital systems because, as we saw, those are the 2 most prominent practice models. If you go to the next slide. So private practice is very appealing because your business can be based on your production, and your production determines your income. And so as you learn clinical efficiency, you can really drive that income and really have autonomy. You can pick your assistants, you have opportunities for entrepreneurship, ancillary ownership, and there may be an existing marketing strategy that you can tap into to help get patients. Next slide. But the downside is your business is based on production. So you really have to focus on building that practice, which means you're going to be knowing your competition, the group, the community. Any type of administrative responsibility you have may take away from your opportunity to build that practice. And you may have a significant amount of obligations to help be productive. Multiple hospitals, a lot of call, weekends, all that stuff could play into it. Next slide. In terms of hospital systems, that's becoming more and more popular because there's a lot of benefits. A professional service agreement is an agreement that basically pays you to provide orthopedic surgery services to a hospital, and they need you. They need these services. And a lot of hospitals have built-in primary care doc affiliations, which can be a huge referral base for you. It can allow a lot of flexibility and stability. You don't have to worry about the nuts and bolts of running a practice. And in an ideal world, the hospitals and surgeons can grow together, and you can kind of have a mutual relationship that benefits you both. Next slide. Downside is you're giving up some autonomy. You may not have as much control over employees and services as you'd like. You may not have as many opportunities for ownership or entrepreneurship. And although they may have very eye-catching numbers for the first 2 years, it's really important to understand what happens if you can't meet your numbers. Does this dollar per RVU change? And can you end up in a situation where they just continue swapping you out for a younger, cheaper model because you're an interchangeable part? Next slide. And so once you understand these things, it's important to realize that no job is perfect. You just have to know the pros and cons and know what to expect so that if you do your homework in advance, you kind of know what you're getting into. And despite this, despite your best efforts, it still might not work out. And so next slide. So the last part I wanted to go through is some nuts and bolts about, well, okay, great, but how do I actually get the job? This is what a lot of people ask me at the start of the fellowship year. And in my opinion, working from the top of this list to the bottom is most important. So the established network, a lot of people, you can go to the next slide. So a lot of people say, hey, you know what? I don't know how to network. I didn't go to business school. I mean, how do I do that? And it's important to realize that you have a network because you've been a resident for 6 years. And this network is all the attendings you've worked with, the residents you've worked with, because they all have different training environments. They know different people. And it's important to tap into this to find a job. If you engage your network to find a job, it's going to separate you from another applicant who may have no connection because you're going to have a personal relationship that's going to set you apart. Next job or next slide. The fellowship director is an important part of this. They have an interest in getting you this job because it's important for the fellowship. So you should count them as part of your network. In general, they'll probably have more academic ties just because of the nature of the position, but they can also tie you into past graduates of the fellowship, specifically if you're focused in certain areas, and they can really plug you into specific areas if that's what you need. Next slide. I found job boards pretty helpful. So AOS and ASES have job boards that we have links to here. We can send these out to you if you guys want. Also, the AMA and the American College of Surgeons has jobs. Journals such as JBJS also have job boards that can be beneficial. Next slide. And if you're dead set on a certain region of the country or a certain city, I think cold emailing is a reasonable option. So with the internet, you can find email addresses of anybody. You know, if you're looking on the ASES website and you're a member, you can find ASES members and you can reach out to them via email and express your interest. This has a low success rate, in my opinion. I did a lot of this looking for jobs. It wasn't super successful, but it may make them think about the fact that you're coming and maybe try to open something up for you. They may not have a job now, but in a year from now, something may become available. If you're going to do it, keep it brief. No one wants to read super long emails. What you should do, include your CV, include why you're interested in the job, something about you, really emphasize why you're dead set on going there. And I think that's your best bet. Next option or next slide. And lastly, consultants. So consultants are great if you don't really have any of these other things. You don't have a network, you don't have any access to this region, but you really need to be there. Tap into consultants. The best jobs, I think, are usually found through your networks or on a website. But you know, as another option, consultants are great. Just bear in mind that they're going to maintain contact with you and keep trying to push other options for you down the road. So just be aware of that as you enlist their help. And that's basically it. Next slide. I wanted to leave a lot of time for questions at the end, just give a brief overview, but any questions, don't hesitate to reach out and you guys will have my email at the end. Thank you.
Thank you very much, James. I'm going to pass the torch. I think this was a great overview from the candidate's perspective, if you will. And now I'm going to have Jennifer Boyle-Maida talk to us from the legal aspect and sort of the nuts and bolts of contract negotiations. Jennifer?
Thank you. Yeah, you can go on to the next slide. I wanted to just sort of do a overview of the contracts. I did do a lot of contracts quite a few years ago, and then actually worked in-house doing contracts for transportation, which was a completely different area, but still contracts. And I think Dr. Hassan failed to mention too that I was a hospital employee at one time as a nurse practitioner. So I also have a little bit of a understanding, even more so than as just the spouse, but a little bit of how the hospitals work and some experience negotiating my own contracts as a nurse practitioner. But that's kind of how it all started. And so that my sort of top 5 rules for Contracts 101 for physicians is, you know, understand the terms, know your market, because it is going to make a difference. Working out the details before you sign, I think this was mentioned before, but, you know, the best time to work out all of your, you know, your concerns, your questions is before you sign. And that's why seeking legal advice is a good idea. It's the employment contract is difficult. It's a little bit nuanced, more so than other kind of business contracts, because it's difficult to be thinking about how it's all going to end as you're trying to get a job or build relationships with a new practice. But the role of the attorney when it comes to these types of contracts is oftentimes more of just a consultative or advice type of situation. They can review the contract, they can make suggestions, alert you to red flags. There are times the attorney will negotiate the contract for you. I have done that. I find that most times early in the career, there's not a whole lot of negotiation the attorney does. It can mostly be done, with advice or maybe some back and forth letters. And it also does depend too on exactly who you're dealing with. Sometimes it's HR, sometimes it's the business manager of the department, and sometimes it is the legal department. If it's the legal department, then oftentimes lawyer to lawyer is best. But I find that most times that's not how it's working. But I do say that, just to have an attorney review and go through and kind of say, hey, this is something you should ask about, or this is something you're concerned about, or this is something that, maybe is missing that you want to ask about. That the cost for something like that is usually pretty nominal, especially compared to the alternative. And you can go to the next slide. Next slide, please.
Yeah.
Did we lose it?
Nope. Sorry.
That's okay.
Let me just go back.
I think Dr. Gregory kind of alluded to this too, when things fall apart, you don't want to be stuck with nothing or working out of your car or something like that. So that to me is the biggest benefit, to try to find the unexpected things that you should be looking for. You can go to the next slide. So like we talked about, the contracts can be a lot of words. I've seen contracts from a page and a half to, multiple 20-page documents in one contract. And so most of the physicians that come to me, what I don't realize is they don't really know what indemnity means. They don't know what it, the difference in malpractice liability, termination, those kinds of things. It's sort of like a whole bunch of words, especially when you get into the longer documents. And there'll be more talk about some of this stuff, but next slide. I sort of look at it, if someone showed me this and said, what do I do with it? I would really have no idea, but luckily nobody is asking me what to do with this. But when you guys get contracts, you might think, okay, I have to go through this and negotiate it myself, but there are people that can review it and give you advice. Next slide. So we're going to just talk about, really in the brief time that we have, because obviously the pieces of a 20-page contract would take a long time, but we'll talk about common provisions that you'll see in each contract, what you should look out for, and just a couple of things of how to protect your interests. Next slide. So the first thing you'll see in every contract are the parties to the contract, and it should be very specific. Who are you, who are they, and especially when it comes to multiple documents, you'll have a party will be the hospital, a party might be the physician group, a party might be the practice. There might be another agreement between the practice and the hospital. There's all kinds of parties, but you want to make sure everyone who is a party to the contract, who has a duty, who is involved, is on the contract. Next slide. And I mentioned duties, that's, so the next part of the contract is going to spell out the duties, what you're expected, what they're expected. A lot of times the physician contracts are very heavy on the you side, meaning you, the physician, and not a whole lot on the them side. And that's when you can really run into some trouble. And you want to make sure that some of that stuff is spelled out. But as far as the physician duties, it's going to be things like providing appropriate care. It'll include your on-call requirements, that you need to maintain your certification, what the expectation is as far as work time, whether it's full-time, part-time, and location. Location is something when there are multiple satellite locations or just multiple locations, that can be very important as far as what your how many patients you're seeing, or what your volume is, how far your travel time is. We talked about geography and location, and you might want to be in an urban setting, but if that institution has satellites 2 hours away in the mountains and you'd be traveling there, or you're expected to travel there, how often would you be expected to travel there, and what kinds of requirements does that involve? And then for the hospital side or the employer side, what OR days are they going to provide? What kind of office space? Who pays for the mid-levels? There are all kinds of different structures for that, and support staff, billing services, and supplies. Next slide. So the next big piece is going to be the compensation, and compensation includes your salary and your benefits. And I know we're going to have more talk on salary, but just to know that there are a lot of different structures out there, some with a lot of creativity, some have a lot more uncertainty, some have a lot more protection. It could be a straight salary, a percentage of collections, dollars per RVU, or a combination of the RVUs and collections. Next slide. Your benefits are going to be life insurance, health insurance, disability insurance, and often those things there's not a whole lot of negotiation involved there. A lot of times those things are pretty standard, but what you might be able to negotiate, other than your salary, which was on the previous slide, but some ancillary spending, professional spending. This isn't going to be a huge chunk usually, but money for CMEs, for courses, your memberships. And then it's also benefits are going to include your retirement fund, liability insurance, any kind of tuition benefits. Next slide. The liability insurance is going to be another piece of your contract, and oftentimes it's going to follow whatever the state requirements are, and the business people will usually know what it needs to be. There are two types, the claims made insurance and the occurrence based. When it's claims made, that's when you want to look at tail coverage, and this can be a point of negotiation. If a lot of times they'll spell out that the physician has to pay the tail coverage, and you can negotiate that, or in certain circumstances that's something that is often negotiated. Next slide. Restrictions. Usually what the contract will say is, it's an exclusive service provision. You're going to work for us. You're going to work for us full time, and unless something is carved out, usually what that means is whatever you do is considered a work for hire. So any income generated for IMEs, consulting, lectures will generally go to the employer unless otherwise specified. And so this is also a piece where you want to look at intellectual property. So that will be a part of it too. Next slide. One of the last pieces is going to be termination. And usually that'll be, so this is the end of the contract. We're not renewing or you're being terminated. You want to look at things like death, what leads to the termination, death and disability, for cause or without cause. And the important things to look at, what are the notice? What's the notice time frame? And what happens to your salary and benefits at the end of the contract? Next slide. Another big piece that always comes up is other restrictive covenants or non-competes. Always get asked about whether they're enforceable, and that is dependent upon where you are. You want to look at three things with, well, first I always say, try to cut that out, say no, but often that's not necessarily an option. But you want to look at, the time, the scope, and the geographic area for that. And you want to limit those as much as possible. And there's other ways to address the non-compete if you cannot have them take that out. And we can talk more about that too. Next slide. And then, so after termination or some other kind of dispute, maybe even while you're still employed, a lot of times there will be a part in the contract that will talk about dispute resolution. So you're already looking at there being an issue, but it'll be an arbitration provision that if there is a dispute, that it'll go to arbitration. And you want to just look at that, what it says, and who will pay the cost if there are any issues. Next slide, is that the last one?
It is. Thank you very much. That was great. And so next I'd like to invite Mike McCaslin to sort of give us some thinking outside the box as we wrap up the sort of didactic portion of the panel. Mike?
Thanks, Sammer. Why James and Jennifer were talking, I made some notes I want to cover real quick that aren't in my slides, but I can't help myself here. I apologize. I didn't have it in my slides. I have no conflicts to disclose, so we're good there. But real quick, 4 notes. One of the things to check on, especially as a subspecialist, what's going to be my clinical workload allocation on the practice I'm joining? Will it be completely my subspecialty, or will I have to kind of cover general services until I can build my practice? Which then is, okay, what's the market I'm trying to be hired in? And is there a large enough population to feed 100% of my subspecialty versus showing up in a market and not asking that question and then finding out that everybody who's subspecialized in the group is doing a little bit of everything plus what they trained in. So I think some of the people that may be in that 70% or 51% of people that transition out and go to a new job didn't get that answer going in and are a little bit surprised at the workload allocation that occurs. How many other competitors am I going to be competing with when I join the group, both within the group and then in the marketplace? Did the group do a market study to determine the surplus or deficit of providers in my subspecialty? And is it more than just replacing a retiring physician, or did you do a market study that shows we have this demand here based upon use rates for your shoulder and elbow services? So you want to know that. And then my last thing that I wrote down was, what's your marketing plan that you will have set up and developed to introduce me to the market, to introduce me to the referring physicians, to make sure that I have every opportunity to build a successful practice. And I'm not, here you go, here's your clinic space, go build a practice. So those are the 4 things that I just jotted down from the original stuff. And now we'll go into some of the other questions that I think you need to ask, because I think you want to go into this and say, I want to make my first 2 years or my first year, if I join a group that only has a 1-year time frame to ownership, but I'd like to make sure those years are invested in a long-term place where I'm not having to get up and leave and go someplace else to join. So Sammer, if we go to the next slide. So I think questions that I think you should be asking along the way. Is my employment agreement the same as others that have signed before me? Okay, so if in fact that we get some things in my work with Jennifer, but I can't get everything else, I just want to make sure, okay, are the things that I am going to have to live with the same that everybody else is going to have to live with? So there's a little bit of comfort, even if it may be something that you think is not, you don't like. Everybody has the same provision, so it's a little bit easier to live with. Clearly, you don't want to sign a contract where you have a covenant not to compete and nobody else does. right? Now so it's really important to make sure that you have the same contract. Is my base compensation set as a matter of the practice structure for all associate physicians, or does it vary? And if it varies, does it vary by subspecialty, or is it vary based on the choice of incentive structures that are flexible and made available? So for example, if I'm more interested in the security of a higher base compensation, is my incentive piece lower because the practice has more risk with me taking a higher base? And conversely, if I really want to bet on myself, can I earn more by taking a lower salary, placing the practice in a lower risk position, but then have more upside if I think I'm going to really outperform on my productivity side? Obviously, I'm negotiating an associate agreement with Jennifer helping, but now I want to see what the owner employment agreement looks like that I'm going to sign when I become an owner. So I need to understand those terms now, because the worst thing that happens is you're there 2 years, you're ready to buy in, you're ready to be made an owner, and then you get a contract and you're going, I can't agree to this and I can't agree to that. Now I've spent 2 years building a practice, and I'm at that point where I'm one of those people that's looking at, oh man, I got to go someplace else. So you want a copy of the owner employment agreement, or if it's an LLC, their operating agreement, so that you can see what's coming down the road. Next slide, Sammer. What's the length of time to become an owner? And can you please detail requirements to be eligible? So is it 1 year? Is it 2 years? Board, I've passed my boards. What about my profit and loss status within the practice, however you measure it? Do I have to be in the black on a cumulative basis for 2 years? If I'm not, can I still become an owner? What happens to any loss that's generated in terms of how you account for that? Is that something I have to repay? Is that offset by the owners? But I would like to know what all the detailed requirements are for eligibility to an owner, because I want to make sure I'm behaving and managing to meet those expectations. And then what's the buy-in? I should know on the day I become an associate what my expected buy-in to be an owner is. Again, I don't want to not know that and show up and somebody says, here's a $500,000 buy-in, and you're, whoa, I didn't know that. Because, and these are questions you should ask, kind of building your own grid with every group that you're interviewing with. So I also then, in this process, want Jennifer to grab a copy of the buy-in agreement, the buy, sell, stock purchase, wherever the provisions are contained. And can you give me a history of the dollar value of the buy-ins for the last 5 buy-ins, so that I can see exactly what the formula is, what the dollar amount is. And I think even just as important, are there other entities that will be available or mandatory? Because in a lot of groups we work with, we have mandatory buy-ins to guarantee succession planning, so that we have physicians in the pipeline to buy doctors out. So if there are other entities, can you tell me what those are? And how many of each? Do we have 2 surgery center entities that we own? Do we have 3 medical office buildings that we own? So what are those assets? And can you tell me the estimated dollar amount of what it's going to be required of me to buy into all those entities? Because again, I think you should know that in making your job decision, so that your expectation is set and you're prepared mentally and you're starting to prepare financially for how that's going to work. I didn't put it here, but I think an important question is, does the group have internal financing for that, where they take a note, or do they have a banking relationship that they will introduce me to, who has financed and helped the physician borrow the money necessary for all the practice buy-ins? So you want to have that thing all lined up and taken care of. Next slide, Sammer. Can I have a copy of each document governing all these related entities, including a copy of buy-in agreement? So again, you want that legal review now, because you want Jennifer to tell you all the challenges or all the issues that are embedded in this agreement. And again, the assumption is all the other owners have signed it. Because they have doesn't mean you want to, or that you're going to be comfortable. So you should be getting ready for that during this, interview process, to make sure, okay, I'm picking them for the long haul. So I should know what the long haul includes. I think you should have an age matrix of all the physicians in the practice, so you can gain an understanding of the number of physicians who may retire over the next 10 to 15 years and the related financial obligations to buy them out. Because I think you should know what the potential financial burden is in those back end years if I've got a cluster of doctors leaving all at the same time. So those buyouts typically come out of current practice profits. And so that could be a reduction in profits available to those practicing physicians as they fund those buyouts. So you need to understand the complete terms, the complete economics on the exit that's coming up for all of your soon-to-be future partners and soon-to-be former partners when they retire. And again, describe the buyout process and financial commitments. Does the group have protections built in on cash flow that would say buyout payments are deferred, or are all buyouts paid on a 5 or 10-year basis so that we can make sure that the annual cash flow is not damaged? So these, I think, are important questions to make sure that you have all the answers before you're offered ownership, so that you already know that you want to be an owner on the day you become an associate employee. Next slide, Sammer. On the hospital health system side, I think you want to know what the survey data is they're utilizing to set compensation, and you want your advisor to be able to also pull that survey data to make sure that we're talking about the same survey data, the same year of the data, and to understand what they're doing in terms of picking subspecialty, general ortho category, where are they getting their WRVU number, and what percentile are they using? What forms of administrative and leadership compensation are available to be earned? In the health system world, you run into a concept that's known as stacking. So you can only get so many additional things because all these result in a total compensation, and all that total amount is what's subject to fair market value. But under the presumption that they're going to start with a moderate amount, you want to know how you can build or stack on and stay within fair market value for additional monies. And obviously you want to know, how do I earn more than the base compensation? And so how does the incentive compensation plan work at renewal? And I think I would say, based upon the pandemic, the transition of inpatient to outpatient care, that hospitals are going to face some pretty challenging financial issues in the next couple of years. So I think a critical question is, at renewal, what very specific factors will go into my compensation for the next contract period? Because I don't know, bait and switch might not be the right word, but I want to be careful of being recruited with this really sweet deal, and then the crash and burn comes on renewal when I've kind of reeled you in, and now I can change the compensation terms because I've already kind of pulled you into my web. So I think it's important to understand that on those renewal terms. Next slide, Sammer. Can I have a list of the orthopedic physicians who have been through the renewal process, so I can understand from their perspective how the renewal process played out? So you want to talk to those people. What went well, what did not go well? How many people did not survive the renewal process and left to go to another health system or left to go back into private practice? Is there anything I'll have an ownership in? Will I be able to own an interest in the surgery center the hospital has? Will I be able to own an ownership interest in a medical office building that maybe houses some of the employed physicians? And again, really important, please show me the information on the retirement plan and retirement plan funding. Unlike in a private practice where part of your retirement may come from a surgery center buyout, your practice buyout, and a medical office building buyout, plus your retirement plan, in the health system, you're going to be primarily dealing with the hospital's qualified and unqualified retirement plans. So I think it's really important to understand those and what the funding level of those are going to be, and have someone help you with some projections on what that's going to lead to in terms of a final balance upon your retirement. I don't know if I have another slide, Sammer, or not.
No, you don't. This was absolutely fantastic. A veritable tour de force. And we still have some time for questions. So I guess I'm going to defer to Drs. Gupta and Levine and take it on. We're ready to help out in any way.
So the first question from the panelists was, how would you suggest finding a good attorney who would be familiar for a medical contract? Where do you look? I mean, beyond just Googling.
Jennifer, you want to take that?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it's challenging. A lot of big practices, not a lot, some have physician representation groups. And often you can find someone in there that does physician contracts. There are plenty of employment lawyers out there that will do contracts, but, you know, and they can be useful. It's just, a lot of times it's word of mouth, see who your mentors have used, ask around. There doesn't really seem to be a good database or way to find an attorney, but I would recommend some of the bigger groups look at their physician representation or ask ask around.
Jennifer, I'm currently finishing my fellowship in New York. I'm taking a job in Florida, and I have a best friend who's a contract attorney in Texas. Does that all work? Or do I need a contract attorney that knows the local environment in Florida, or is that not material?
I wouldn't say it's immaterial, but it's not necessarily required. There's very few things that are state specific that, you know, we wouldn't have access to the information. Knowing the environment is one thing. From a legal perspective, there isn't a lot that it would have to be an in-state attorney. So I would say if your best friend does it in Texas, I would have them look at it, or I would ask them. And then oftentimes what I do, if there's something outside my realm or very specific, I will find someone to consult on that or in that area.
Great. Next question for the group. What are your thoughts about taking a job that doesn't have a guaranteed salary to start, but rather a job that pays a salary on a 0% promissory and essentially eat what you kill from the start, especially during the pandemic? This is one of the questions from our folks in the audience.
So why don't we go ahead and get everyone to comment on it? Start with you, Mike, and then James, and then Jennifer.
Yeah, I don't know that that's a terrible thing, but I would want the calculation of how I'm going to be compensated on an eat what you treat method detailed, so that I know exactly when I have my collections come in, what expenses are going to be charged against my collections, both in a general overhead, you know, so I want every line item spelled out on how I'm going to earn that when I start collecting money. So that to me, when it's a zero promissory, I can understand, well, okay, you're going to eat what you treat, but I don't want to be left to some crazy calculation I wasn't prepared for on all of a sudden I'm making a quarter of what I thought I should make based upon my collection. So I think that part would have to be spelled out from a business perspective, or my CPA side of me.
Yeah.
James?
And I'd say from like the surgeon standpoint, I think it depends on your risk tolerance, right? And so if you're someone who's like, hey, you know what, I've started a family, you know, I'm maybe the only one working, I really need a guaranteed salary because we need that. I don't feel comfortable having no safety net, then that's probably not the job for you. But on the other hand, you're like, hey, you know what, I like that. I like to be incentivized for production. I like the upside's not capped. That may be different. It also is different depending on what you want to do. If you want to say, hey, I'm going to be a subspecialist and then that's all I'm going to treat, you're going to ramp up more slowly. Your income's going to suffer. If you're said, hey, you know what, I don't care, I'm going to see anything that comes through that door, then that may be, again, a better environment for you. So I think it all depends on kind of what you're interested for in terms of looking at the job.
Jennifer, anything to add?
Kind of reiterating the same, but if there's one thing this past year has shown us is that you don't know what's coming down the pike, whether it's pandemic, whether it's, you know, something with your own life, whether it's something with how things work in the hospital or with your partner or, you know, whatever. It's hard to even imagine the things that can happen. And so, you know, again, yeah, it is your risk tolerance, but I think that's risky.
I do want to add one other thing that we've seen from the pandemic, and that is you should expect to start seeing in all new associate contracts provisions that give the practice the right to stop compensation or defer it in the event of something similar to this happening again. Because where those contracts, I mean, Jennifer, maybe you saw that before the pandemic, but that didn't really exist before. So we're seeing all contractual relationships with vendors, with physicians, with everybody having pandemic type provisions baked in now.
Yeah, Mike, good question coming in from one of the folks. How much negotiating power do you have as a chief resident or as a fellow, and how do you know how much to ask for?
You know, that's probably why I say, can I see what the other people have signed? Because I want to know, I want to be careful of negotiating myself out of the room where they just say, okay, this is a little, I want to be careful of being obnoxious. So I think you have a little bit maybe on a variation of getting to the same place. That's why I said, I think the last question fits this. I have a range of base comp potentially where I'm willing to take some more risk on the economics for some more upside. By and large, if most of the other physicians have signed the contract that's been put in front of you, the practice is going to say, I'm really not interested in changing this for the other people. So, you'll get as much value from Jennifer educating you on what you're signing as probably as much as you'll get on being able to leverage much of that. So it really depends. I think the larger the group, you probably have less flexibility. The smaller the group, there's less issues over historical issues or I've done this. But if I'm going to have to redo it for 25 doctors in the group, that's going to be a different issue.
Yeah, one thing I'd chime in about negotiation, I completely agree with that point, but I'd say you should also look for ways to expand the pie, right? So a lot of the nuts and bolts may not be that negotiable, but if you can come up with creative ways to say, okay, hey, the salary is what it is, but like, say I'm interested in getting kind of an executive MBA type thing, and going into, is that something that the practice can support? Something that's going to potentially drive value for both you and the group. You can try to think outside the box and try to add stuff like that in to maybe get a little bit creative.
One other thing related to that is I think you need to make sure you understand where you're going to be located to practice. What you don't want to do is do as the one question asked, I'm going to take 100% risk. And then they send you to Timbuktu to start a new location. And that wasn't a part of your discussion, but they're going, hey, we don't have to pay them anything. Great, we'll send them up there. And that's a lot different than someone I'm paying a $300,000. So that's a pretty important element, is to make sure that you understand when you sign what offices or office will be my practice location.
Can I just make one point? I've hired 31 orthopedic surgeons in the last 5.5 years, and from all levels, fresh out of fellowship, mid-career, and senior, and they're all different, and the contracts are different, and the details are different based on where you are and who you are. So you need to know your local environment. You need to know what the fair market value is for a job in the marketplace you're looking at. My fellows that are looking in Long Island know they're going to get lower salaries than if they come to Manhattan or come to Westchester. That's just what Long Island does. So you can't ask for Manhattan salary if you're going to Long Island. You'll out negotiate yourself. So that's really critical. The flip side is, to your point, Ravi, your question is, you never have a better time to negotiate than before you start. So you cannot look at it as like, I'm going to be so happy to match in your fellowship or match in your residency. It's the one time we finally are looking for a job as an adult. And as an adult, you have to ask for what is reasonable. As James said, it's not all about making your personal income better, but it might be that what you're bringing to the group is going to be valuable. And these are the things that I'm going to do to help make this better for you as a group. And that also needs to be negotiated ahead of time.
So I had a question. I'm thinking also, listening to these talks, the COVID pandemic has had clearly implications in terms of practice preferences and perhaps weathering the storm, larger groups, larger systems versus small practices that may have a harder time. Do you think this is going to be relevant in terms of decision-making for folks starting out their career? Or how relevant is this, recognizing that the pandemic at some point is going to pass? James, Jennifer, any thoughts?
I think that's a great question. And I think it's making, in my experience with the residents and fellows, it's making people look more for the safety nets. When you're coming right through a crisis like this, it's fresh in your mind. You see what's going on and you say, hey, you know what? I don't want to be in a situation where I'm not getting paid for 6 months or however, because everything's shut down. And so what I've seen from the fellows is that they're more kind of interested in the guaranteed salaries.
Jennifer, any thoughts?
My thought was, I know this is shoulder elbow, but I will say that trauma did not suffer during the pandemic. So,
Well, I think there's some other things that on a more macro level is a lot of orthopedic groups, while we had many, and I spent about 95% of my time with orthopedic groups, by the way. So in the first couple of months of the pandemic, we had groups down to 15% of their standard volume. By, I would say, December, we had a lion's share of the groups that had recovered and exceeded 2019 results. But part of that, and so this is my bias or concern on the health system side versus the private practice side, a lot of that was the pent-up demand for elective cases rapidly moved to the surgery center. And this was even an elderly population that has historically felt way more comfortable in a hospital, who looked at it and said, that's a COVID trap. So we saw a huge movement of elderly patients to surgery centers that might be a permanent change. So we were already experiencing this transition from inpatient to outpatient, and COVID accelerated it. And so that's permanent. And the challenge with that is orthopedics is a big lifesaver for hospitals and health systems. Great margin. And so I'm a little nervous about the future economics of those systems and to be able to support what we've seen in the last 10 years in physician compensation structures, because I think there's a lot of economics that's gone away permanently there.
Yeah, I think that's a very, very sort of sage observation. I mean, we've seen that with our healthcare system pivoting now to build ambulatory surgery centers to try and stay, if not ahead, at least on pace, which also means that private practice groups that are heavily vested in surgery centers may also be in a very healthy position moving forward. There's some risk on the practice side, right? Eat what you kill model, but on the back end, potential for ancillaries as they're in a good position to negotiate and leverage the ASC experience, if you will, with payers. Wouldn't you agree?
I would say the next 10 years will be the best 10 years for surgery center ownership that we've probably seen in a while. We were probably flat for the past 5 to 10 years because we'd kind of peaked, but I think you're going to see an interest. We're seeing private equity chasing surgery centers. The hospitals that previously said no to the physician group that said you want to joint venture it with us are now trying to buy into physician practice surgery centers, besides just build their own, but trying to. So it's a really hot potato.
Well, and I think that ties in with shoulder arthroplasty coming off the Medicare inpatient only list. I think that's all kind of, everything's pointing in the same direction.
Those are all
and
great.
again, if we think about the benefit to patients, it lowers the cost of care to patients. So it's a great thing for everybody in theory.
So Jennifer, just one final question. I was really intrigued by this. I saw in that article that cited a 51% turnover within 5 years. They looked at the distribution of surgeons and retaining contract attorneys for contract negotiations. And it was an ironic finding that those that self-reported the least amount of business acumen were least likely to retain an attorney. And so I just was interested in your perspective. Why would anyone not seek legal counsel in this process? Any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I have a couple of thoughts. I think it's partially, you don't know what you don't know. Oftentimes, especially younger physicians are afraid to ask. They don't. When you bring an attorney in, it can often be seen as adversarial. And I think when young physicians or anyone is negotiating one of their first jobs, they don't want to be adversarial. I always advise people, it's like, you know what, great, I'm gonna have somebody look over this and I'll get back to you if I have questions, not in an adversarial manner. And that's why I find most people don't necessarily want that initial employment contract negotiated by the attorney, because then that they feel like that creates friction. But just a simple sort of, I'm not as familiar with this, so I'm going to have someone look at it. And you mentioned, my whatever best friend in Texas, sometimes just saying, what, I have a family member who's an attorney or a friend, and if I'm just going to have them take a look at it, make sure I didn't miss anything. But people are afraid to bring an attorney in sometimes. So I think that's why. So
with that, thank you, everyone. Our hour has concluded. I appreciate the time, efforts that Samara, Jennifer, Mike, James, all of you put into tonight's excellent session. We appreciate it. Next week's session will be about building your team and setting up your practice. Dr. Levine will be leading that for our hour. And with that, thank you, everyone. We appreciate your time and efforts. Stay safe.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Appreciate everyone being here. Thank you to the panelists. Have a good night.
Good night.
Good night.
Thank you.